Look at a map of the world today. The borders you see, the names of the countries, the languages spoken inside them, the legal systems that govern them, and the institutions that connect them across oceans, almost none of that arrangement was inevitable. Decisions made by European governments helped build it piece by piece over centuries. Now, remove that influence. Imagine that European governments never project power beyond Europe, never build colonial reach, and never help define the international rules that other societies eventually live under. What changes first? The map? The economy? The very idea of how countries should relate to one another? Treat this neither as a moral judgment nor as a fantasy with one neat ending. It is a thought experiment about historical dependence. To use it honestly, we have to separate what research can tell us from what can only be imagined. Europe would not vanish. The rest of the world would not stop changing. But the pathways connecting those changes would be different. And the question at the center is simple. If Europe never fills the global stage, who does? The rules of this experiment matter. Europe does not disappear from the scenario. European people remain, along with the science, philosophy, universities, and legal traditions that developed inside Europe. The scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, modern universities, legal systems, and capitalism all predate large-scale imperialism. So a world without European global influence is not a world without European innovation. Europe would still modernize. It would still produce ideas, institutions, and technologies of its own. The difference is the speed and scale at which those developments travel, and the resources available to support them. Researchers argue that empire provided cheap resources, captive markets, and vast capital flows that accelerated European growth. Without those advantages, Europe develops more slowly, more evenly, and with less global reach. That distinction is crucial. We are not removing every European idea from history. We are removing the power that carried European structures far beyond the continent and made them increasingly difficult for other societies to ignore. Europe remains one region among several, not an absent region, but a less dominant one. This is not a story about erasing Europe. It is a story about what the rest of the world looks like when Europe does not arrive in the same way. There is another complication. Europe was never a self-contained source of change. Modern Europe can be understood not only as an engine of global transformations, but also as a product of them. People, ideas, and resources moved across regions, and those wider movements helped shape the continent that later projected power outward. That means removing European influence does not leave the rest of the world frozen at the moment before European expansion. It removes one especially powerful connection from a much larger web. Other connections remain possible. Other societies still interpret events, develop political communities, exchange ideas, and respond to pressures around them. The direction of change would branch rather than stop. Europe might still become more modern, but its modernization would have less global reach. Elsewhere, societies that in our timeline were forced to respond to European expansion would instead face different choices and different pressures. Some might preserve existing arrangements, others might change through their own internal debates or through relationships with neighboring regions. We cannot draw that alternate history in precise detail. What we can say is that Europe's role was relational. It shaped the wider world, but the wider world also shaped Europe. Remove that relationship, and both sides develop along different paths. The clearest changes would appear in the political map. European expansion did not merely add new names to an existing world. It altered which political communities became states, where borders were placed, and which populations were brought together under governments that had not previously existed in that form. In this thought experiment, those changes do not happen in the same way. Researchers argue that many modern settler democracies are inseparable from imperial expansion. A non-colonial world is therefore also a world in which several present-day states do not exist in their current form. That is not a claim that every familiar country disappears, or that one alternate map can be drawn with confidence. It is a claim about dependency. When the process that created a state is removed, The resulting state cannot simply be assumed to appear anyway. Borders would look different. Population patterns would be different. Political identities would be different because the communities being asked to share a country or to define themselves against another country would not have been assembled in the same way. Indigenous civilizations would persist and evolve along paths not interrupted by the same form of expansion. The result might include larger or smaller political units, different federations, or entirely different relationships between neighboring societies. We cannot know their names or boundaries, but we can identify the kind of change. The map would be a record of different historical choices rather than a rearrangement of the map we already know. If Europe does not project power outward, does another civilization simply take its place? That is the tempting answer, but it is also the least secure. A vacuum on a map does not automatically produce a replacement empire. Power depends on choices, resources, institutions, geography, and historical timing. Remove one path, and the alternatives do not line up in a predictable queue. The United States, China, regional powers, or overlapping coalitions might shape the wider order differently, but none is a guaranteed substitute. The more cautious possibility is a world of several strong centers rather than one global rule maker. Regional powers could influence events close to home while negotiating with one another across wider networks. Their interests might overlap in some areas and conflict in others. Some rules could spread between regions, others could remain local or contested. That would not make the world automatically freer, more peaceful, or more equal. It would simply make the distribution of influence different. There might be less pressure toward one common template, but also less agreement about what a common template should be. The key point is that Europe's absence creates a space for many possible actors, not a guaranteed successor. Asking who fills the vacuum may therefore be the wrong question if it assumes that one actor must inherit the whole role. The alternate world may be defined precisely by the fact that no one does. The question becomes more complicated when we move from territory to rules. Global influence is not only the ability to control land, it is also the ability to make certain assumptions seem normal. How sovereignty is understood, how states negotiate, how trade is organized, how disputes are discussed, and which political standards are treated as legitimate. European governments helped shape the international systems and standards that later reached far beyond Europe. Without that influence, other communities would still need ways to manage relationships. Trade would still create questions about access and obligation. Neighboring powers would still need to negotiate, compete, and sometimes cooperate. Political communities would still develop ideas about authority and responsibility, but the resulting framework would not necessarily look like a single, broadly shared system. It might be more regional, more varied, and more openly contested. Different societies could preserve different assumptions instead of being pressed toward one dominant vocabulary. That could mean greater room for local autonomy. It could also mean more uncertainty when different systems meet and no widely accepted rule settles a dispute. This is where documented history ends and counterfactual reasoning begins. We can identify European influence on international standards and institutions. We cannot identify one certain replacement for it. China might shape some rules. The United States might shape others. Regional powers or coalitions might create their own arrangements. None would simply reproduce Europe's role, because each would bring different priorities and different ideas about order. A world without European rulemaking is therefore not a world without rules. It is a world in which the authorship of those rules is more distributed and perhaps more visibly disputed. European integration offers a useful, documented example of how political influence can operate without taking the form of outward expansion. Since 1948, modern European integration has been built on a supranational foundation. Its stated purpose was to make war among its members unthinkable and materially impossible, and to reinforce democracy among them. That goal matters because it shows Europe not only as a force that shaped relationships beyond the continent, but also as a region experimenting with a new relationship inside itself. Governments that might otherwise act separately were placed within a structure designed to make conflict harder and cooperation more durable. In a world where European governments never influenced the wider international order, that particular political project would not be available as an example in the same form. Another region might develop its own method of limiting conflict. It might not. We cannot assume that a different actor would reproduce the same design or pursue the same goals. The broader lesson concerns standards as well. One accepted analysis argues that an influential and integrated Europe radiates values and standards that are necessary and rare in the world. Whether one accepts that assessment in full or not, it identifies a real kind of influence, the ability to make certain principles part of international discussion. Remove that influence and the principles do not automatically vanish. But their reach, interpretation, and political support could change. Some might be defended by other actors. Some might become more fragmented. Some might be contested more openly. The world would not lose the possibility of standards. It would lose one important source of their promotion and diffusion. That is a gap, not a guarantee of either progress or decline. This thought experiment also matters because Europe is already no longer the uncontested center of global affairs. A global history analysis argues that Europeans no longer dominate the world, and that, unlike during the Cold War, the European theater itself is no longer the strategic center. In the early 1950s, the United States treated Western Europe as its most important region. Today, while supporting Ukraine against Russia, it considers China its most important competitor. The comparison does not prove that our world has become the alternate world described here. Europe still has influence, and its history still shapes the present, but it shows that global centrality can change. Forecasts cited in the research also suggest that within a few short decades, the weight of European economies in the world could fall to less than half of what it is today. Again, that is not evidence for one exact future. It is a reason to take the question of replacement seriously. As Europe's relative weight declines, influence may become more distributed across the United States, China, regional powers, and overlapping coalitions. That resembles the thought experiment in one respect. There is no reason to expect one clean successor to inherit every European role. Different actors may shape different rules, relationships, and standards. The result could be more competition over whose assumptions become normal. It could also be more space for regional choices. What remains unresolved is whether a more distributed order produces better outcomes, because distribution alone does not tell us how power will be used. The present is not a world without Europe. It is a reminder that Europe has never been the only author of the world, and may become less central to its next chapter. So, what would the world look like if European governments had never exerted global influence? It would not be a blank world, and it would not be a simple utopia or dystopia. Europe would still modernize and innovate, but without the acceleration supplied by empire's cheap resources, captive markets, and capital flows, its growth and reach would likely be slower and smaller. Beyond Europe, borders, population patterns, political identities, and several modern settler democracies would develop differently. International rules and standards would still exist in some form, but their authorship would be more plural, their reach less predictable, and their authority more contested. European integration would not provide the same documented example of making war among members unthinkable and materially impossible while reinforcing democracy, and no single replacement power would be guaranteed to take Europe's place. The central lesson is not that Europe shaped everything or that removing Europe would solve everything. Europe helped shape the modern world, but it shaped it through a world that also shaped Europe. Remove that influence, and history does not end. It branches. The world becomes different, not necessarily simpler, better, or worse, but organized around different power centers. Different borders, different institutions, and different answers to the question of who gets to write the rules. If this thought experiment changed how you see the world you live in, share it with someone who needs to see it too. The history underneath the map you were handed is worth knowing.